This video is written under the assumption you viewed my previous video on Ace Combat 4. Ace Combat 0 The Balkan War, much like 4 and 5, is a flight arcade simulator hybrid that balances responsive controls with a manual approach to aerial maneuverability. It's a prequel and the earliest canonical entry in the Ace Combat fictional Strange Real universe. It maintains the same basic game engine and mission structure of the previous two titles, and builds upon Ace Combat 5's squadron system, offering both technical improvements and differences in intention. A key example being this cutscene, which shows a stronger sense of momentum between the cutscenes and gameplay that the team has developed in that time. Despite its gameplay being so similar to previous entries, it still manages to entertain and surprise with gimmicks and a fresh story full of intrigue and ambivalent morality. The introduction here is given in 2005 by a man in war-torn ruins, clearly a combatant of some kind. This is Zero Wing Pixie, the primary interviewee and closest ally of Cypher, our player protagonist, during the titular 1995 Balkan War. The presentation this time is jarringly different from the anime still frames and CG cutscenes of the previous games. This time, there are Western actors fully costumed, placed in almost convincingly computer-generated backgrounds. It's difficult to tell where the real stage ends and the CG begins, just that the CG is most certainly there. It's a common technique in writing. The opening lines once again set up the core themes. Framing the rest of the game, he directly references the morality system which the player will be judged. It's a slightly more articulate morality system than is seen in most Western games, which on its surface deals with the apparent spectrum of morality between a knight, a soldier, and a mercenary, all characterized by different reflective traits. The tone of Ace Combat 0 is quite openly bleak and morally upset, and it's reflected in both story and gameplay. For after all, what is man in nature? A nothing in relation to infinity, all in relation to nothing. A central point between nothing and all, and infinitely far from understanding either. The ends of things and their beginnings are impregnably concealed from him, in an impenetrable secret. He is equally incapable of seeing the nothingness out of which he is drawn, and the infinite in which he is engulfed. Mission 1. Glacial Skies. The Balkan War is something of a direct analogue to our own Second World War, made all the more worrying by the relatively advanced technological state of Strange Real's 1995. Belka takes the role of the antagonistic side, but in true Ace Combat fashion it's not so simple. In stark contrast to Ace Combat 4, instead of focusing up to the sky from the ground level, we take a hard look at the ground metaphorically from the sky. The narrative relies on a heavier emphasis of geopolitics and the reactions of those who fly within the wars created by it. The cutscene represents most of the finer details of the war visually, so many details might fly under your radar. To sum it up simply, there's three major players in the war: the moderately sized Belka, the massive Osia, and the tiny Ustio. The Balkan Federation is in economic crisis. In order to manage its budget, multiple states are allowed to secede, leaving Belka a smaller country. Ustio is one such state, leaving it an independent country. Osia, a more successful rival federation to Belka, has an economic upturn and begins to adopt several of the states that Belka had shed. Despite these efforts, Belka's economic crisis isn't getting fixed. The country is waning economically and territorially. The people of Belka elect a far-right party implied to also be extremely nationalist. As if despite everyone involved, Ustio discovers vast natural resources on its land, and Belka does what comes naturally, invading almost every country it shares a border with. At first this will seem irrational, but whilst hinted in the game, there is some clearer motivation for Belka's actions in exterior material. Ustio, likely not having a decently trained standing army to begin with, is a freshly minted country, never mind an army that survived Belka's initial onslaught, uses its newfound wealth to hire mercenaries. That's the backdrop to our story. Our protagonists are Cypher and Pixie, a newly paired team of Ustio mercenaries, both seemingly opportunistically fighting in this war to make a profit. Taking the time to watch Pixie in the initial moments, he'll be casually rolling his plane. You could take it as a sort of body language showing both his talent and his cocky spirit, despite being placed into the secondary role to the player. Even though he's flying a plane that vastly outclasses your own by potentially generations, he doesn't seem to mind. Other characters in this mission seem to treat Pixie with the same revere that characters were treating Mobius 1 at the height of his career. Regardless, he seems to take a liking to Cypher by the end of the mission. In a way, Pixie's status among friendlies serves as a shortcut to elevate Cypher when Pixie is clearly impressed by him. The two form GARM team, Cypher as GARM 1 and Pixie as GARM 2. This game seems to make the assumption that you've likely played the previous two games, or at least one, because the immediate gameplay difference from the previous entries is how aggressive the enemies are. Just comparing normal modes as a guideline anyway. Compared to Ace Combat 4's initial mission, the scenario design is very similar, but there are simply more targets. Relative to the enemy bombers, which stand in as easy targets, the player is no longer directly behind them for ease of acquaintance with the lock-on system. And furthermore, the escorting planes will put a lot more effort into interrupting you, and forcing some direct air-to-air play if you're easily coaxed. Perhaps this was done because of difficulty complaints, or it's a mistake. Regardless, it better fits with the dog-eat-dog mood of the game's narrative. There's also a few minor changes to some of the secondary weapons. The XMAA that targets multiple enemies seems to have a larger range with more tracking, and the QAAM, which was once a guaranteed hit, has now lost some of that utility, but it's a welcome addition since Ace Combat 5 regardless. The SAAM has got a very long-range lock-on, and it doesn't home in on enemies entirely automatically. It takes information for the enemy location from the front cone of vision of your plane. It will lose track if you can't keep sight of them. As such, with some savvy play you can fire the missile and curve that bad boy to chase the enemy plane for you without giving a direct chase yourself. It's honestly a lot of fun, but it does need some concentration to use. Mission 2, Annex. Over the first few missions, if the player is already used to the plane combat, they'll come to terms with how the interactions in-game will affect their Ace style, the aforementioned morality system. These are based on the player's effective hostility to yellow targets. There are three general types of yellow target. 1. At times the player will engage in dogfights and they will only neutralize the enemy. These enemies will become non-combative and try to exit the stage. 2. Non-offensive enemies spawned as part of the scenario, such as retreating enemies. 3. Non-offensive or seemingly civilian ground targets. In Mission 2, the first example of civilian ground targets are shown as windmills and houses. When the player destroys them, Pixie will comment that these houses are likely holding supplies for the Belkans. Whilst it makes sense, there's obviously no guarantee those houses aren't merely civilian, or even that if any of them are makeshift supply bases, they may well be housing civilians anyway. The yellow targets in the game system are treated as an opportunity to acquire a higher score, and therefore more credits to buy planes. By showing this interest in financial gains, the game judges you as leaning toward the mercenary style. Conversely, showing absolutely no hostility to yellow targets, or even going out of your way to ignore them, is interpreted as chivalry, and the game judges you toward knight style. By picking and choosing, only eliminating some yellow targets, the Ace style meter won't swing too far from its default central position, which is the soldier style. Speaking of which, just to tease you, the first mission unlocks a new plane, an endgame plane, the X-02, with a price tag only a heartless bastard could afford. You would imagine this means that the mercenary style is the one with the most negative karma narratively. This assumption is reasonable at first. This system is relatively well realized narratively. Your actions are reflected in numerous pieces of small in-game dialogue as well as cutscenes, and it encourages you to consider what exactly you're trying to do in this war and your place in it. But it requires an assumption that the player is willing to participate in the role-playing exercise of the morality system. Rather than appealing to three kinds of ace that Pixie sets up at the start, you could just really want a lot of points for a fresh new plane, and then decide you're happy enough and start playing to proceed the story. This type of player is not really participating in the seeming intent of the morality system. In a way, your actions are driven by the game system, and you play an unwitting role in the story. At worst, this system attempts to create a consistent narrative based on your actions in the hope that the player will begin to reflect on their actions. At the end of this mission, Pixie quips back at AWACS calling him Solo Wing, which is in reference to a story not found in-game despite it being a rather large part of Pixie's characterization. Based on a nearly identical story of an Israeli pilot, Pixie lost a wing during combat, and instead of ejecting, he decided to flee and land the thing. It shows what kind of a person Pixie is. He's not grounded until he's grounded, and he'll never give up. And his pride in his accomplishment is reflected in the asymmetric paintwork of his plane. The problem here is that the story can only be found on a piece of paper that came with a Japanese-only limited edition 1/72nd scale plastic model of his plane, along with various other information about his background, like he's a war orphan and from Belka. Having extra story outside of a product is fine, There's plenty of examples. Pokemon had several versions of its basic premise between its game, anime, and manga. The Dragon Dragoon and Nier series has several extraneous novellas in Japan-only stage plays that fill in small story progressions in between the games. There's countless examples of video games being adapted to other mediums which are perfectly acceptable too. But these examples aren't necessary to enjoying the game you've already bought. I'm a strong believer that your packed product should be more or less a complete product, as far as is reasonable anyway. It's arguable how necessary these two small pieces of backstory are, which are clearly hinted at but seen fit to be left only as hints by the developers. You might want to try to call these backstories unnecessary to the enjoyment or extraneous for argument's sake. My argument is that these details strengthen the narrative and provide a more ambivalent atmosphere and stronger character moments. If you stay with me until the end, perhaps I'll have convinced you. Mission 3 reveals the consequences of the A-style system. Mission 3 is set in the Roundtable, the first of many references to Arthurian legend. Arthur's Roundtable was said to be so that none who sat at it had precedence over another, a completely even playing field. Likewise, Pixie's narration explains the Roundtable was the nickname for the area B7R, a strategically important position for the war and all parties. It's seen as even ground like the legend, where no pilot has a strategic or underhanded advantage over the other, regardless of their nationality. It's hard to imagine how, but it's implied that electromagnetic interference doesn't let you see enemy jets until you're already in the combat area. After a real challenge of a fight having several planes dogpile you and Pixie, there's a twist. From the west, a new boss squadron will approach. One of 3 boss squadrons actually, dependent on your A-style. The teams are Rot, Grun and Indigo, German translations for colours. Each team takes the Gault team differently, Rot and Indigo trash-talking you as mercenaries, and Grun calmly calling your flying unorthodox. Regardless, their 4-plane formations are somewhat chaotic, and their different choices of planes changes Pixie's advice for the player. The rest of the game follows something like this format. Almost all missions, including the first, have some slight dialogue or enemy spawn variation based on the player's A-style. For this specific example, however, the leader of each team will appear in interviews shown after missions 6 and 18 in 2 halves. The first one, in which they recall how they were shot down by Cypher, outmaneuvered and outwitted, amazed at how unlikely it was that 2 planes could do so much damage. What comes out of the initial cutscene is small hints of their characters. Their impressions of you reveal impressions of themselves. When you place a character in front of a camera and make them tell a story, the story is what you're there for, and it's the connective tissue of the scene. But the character telling you the story ends up inputting their own personality into the tale. Their own values come out when they criticize yours, their own experiences are echoed in how they judge the situations. When a character tells a story like this, the scene becomes a dissection of the character. So something as simple as a minute cutscene where they simply explain similar stories of how they were shot down is enough to familiarize yourself. At the end of this mission, it's revealed that you and Pixie were sent into this hellish charade as interference for other operations. You two probably weren't expected to live. This sense that your higher-ups are using body-rich, heartless tactics to achieve war is instilled early by making you the subject. This setup will probably make you a bit more empathetic to everyone else you'll see getting fucked over in future missions. Other than just Ace-style variations, the game also has a few missions with divergent scenarios based on your preference, set up on the map. The scenarios fall into 3 major categories: air-to-air, air-to-ground, or a mixture of both. Dependent on the variation of mission, you may be given more yellow targets, for example, or more high-value targets. For these divided missions, the maps are the same, but they have effectively remixed enemy placements. Ace Combat Zero is a relatively brief game compared to its series, but it makes up for this by increasing its replayability threefold with so many detours in the narrative and the gameplay. Many of these changes, however, aren't enough to bring up in the interest of time. In Mission 6, for instance, it's a difference of 1 throwaway line on the radio. The initial missions until now have been dismal in tone, but this time there's finally an upward trend. Directus is the capital of Ustio, and the opportunity to free it means reclaiming all of Ustio's borders, a true tipping point for the war driven by the already legendary Gault team. There's 5 clumps of enemies to attack, with differing miniature scenes to distinguish them slightly. The first couple fall easily enough, and as you destroy the second sector, a Belkan general attempts to flee the combat situation via helicopter, and in a stroke of genius, he declares it over open communications, offering himself as a nice, high-value yellow target on radar. As you begin to clear out the third sector, the centre of the capital, the Belkans give feedback by reacting over radio, panicking and complaining as expected. But now there's also direct to civilians. They start chanting over radio things like, "The Belkans are running," and "Belkans, get out! Get the hell out of our city! We gotta take back what's ours!" Some of the enemies are placed directly next to the bell towers as a lure, to fish the player close when the towers begin emitting the sound of bells ringing, complete with Doppler effect. Last video I brought up that players perhaps not participating in a game's set pieces was something of an inherent concession of video games as a medium, but this is an example of how you can encourage certain behaviour by positioning without having to change how the player interacts with the game at all. The situation evolves from the ground level while you continue to clean up the ground and sky forces. The voice acting for something so subsidiary is very well directed, with Belkan soldiers clearly getting overwhelmed by the inhabitants. There's even signs of this from the sky. If you don't destroy non-necessary ground targets, they too will turn friendly as soon as you free the sectors, implying either the APCs have been taken over, or these Belkan soldiers had a sudden change of heart when all their comrades had been wiped off the map with ease. Watching and hearing this play out while the music pounds the big main motif, the beautiful string and brass orchestra is just fantastic. It's a fantastic example of a small mission-long sub-story to drive the game to new heights that Ace Combat is so good at doing. Clearly, Cypher and Pixie are doing nothing but good work here, regardless of if the player is doing it to make some dirty money or if they're choosing to valiantly represent their country. After you've eliminated the Belkan forces, the Gault squadron will fly in to save the day, I suppose. They're another interesting example of the enemy AI being vastly more intelligent than previous games. Pixie takes a back seat for this fight, mostly because it acts as a kind of soft puzzle. The two-plane formation is a real one, where two enemy planes split up, fishing you to attack one single plane whilst the other takes advantage of your distraction to get a bead on your tail. You'll have to figure out how to counter this on your own. They'll start using less effective tactics when their formation is properly disrupted. Each jet is actually unique, so depending on which you take down first, different dialogue elaborates on the situation. If the wingman remains, without effective orders from Gelb 1, he's not much for tactics. If you nail Gelb 2, Gelb 1 will directly order him to eject. It says a lot about their individual dynamics as a team, that Gelb 2 may not have been cut out for combat but was dragged into it anyway. In turn, you could imagine this says a lot about the Belkan side of the war, whom they end up recruiting like this. Some quick narration comments that this is where the real war begins. In a way, the first 6 missions are sectioned off into a prologue of sorts. The game loves to remind us what this game is about. The narrator almost too often comments that his focus isn't necessarily on the game's namesake war, but on Cypher and his journey through it. It's suspicious to me. After all, the interviewer is referencing the player in this. The consistent reiteration may be an attempt to coax the player into try and figure out for themselves who Cypher is, based on their experiences through the lens of the Ace-style system so far. Who Cypher is, and what he was doing, are what the interviewer is trying to illuminate. The interviews more clearly focus on those who've interacted with Cypher in battle, and how it changed them. Then, even nothingness was not, nor existence. There was no air then, nor the heavens beyond it. What covered it? Where was it? In whose keeping? Was there cosmic water in depths unfathomed? But, after all, who knows and who can say whence it all came, and how creation happened? The gods themselves are later than creation, so who knows truly whence it has arisen? Whence all creating had its origin, he, whether he fashioned it or whether he did not, he who surveys it all from the highest heaven, he knows. Or maybe even he does not know. The quotes so far have been on the subject of creation and end. The first being from French philosopher Pascal, whom spoke in relation to how mankind cannot possibly understand its origin, nor where it is in relation to the world we were born into. In relation to the game, it perhaps puts the war in an almost nihilistic perspective. The second quote here, the last in the game that appears quoted from a real-world source, is a Hindu song of praise from the Rig Veda about the origin of the world. Or more accurately, about the unknown origin of the world, one that not even the gods know. Taken on its own, it's quite a powerful line of questioning that suggests not even their gods are almighty. There's a relation and theme between the two quotes. The first elaborates that man is so far from understanding all and nothing it's impossible. In the context of this first quote, the second confers that possibly, nothing is equivalent to the infinite in some meaningful way. For the nothingness that man arose from was a circumstance where even nothingness was not. The line in the second quote regarding in whose keeping the pre-creation universe was in, within the context of this game in particular, draws some attention to the arbitrary nature of the war. This is a fight over the borders that decides whose land is whose, like any war. Who owns this land? Who deserves to own this land? Who owned it before humans decided it was theirs? This question seems to ask who owned it before it was even land. Once again, a very nihilistic perspective. It's something Pixie and another soldier comment on in Mission 8, cementing the theme. The foreign view is almost serene from the sky, and that the war is such a shame. From a purely objective standpoint from the universe, there is no distinction between landmasses, especially from space. The barriers between America and Canada, North and South Korea, or even Germany and Poland, they're entirely fabricated by humans. The philosophy proposed by Pixie here assumes that these borders are projected by the rulers of the people, the politicians above them, perhaps even some kind of royalty in the past. There are arguments against this, and I'll propose them when the time is right, but we're following the arc of the story for now, so I hope you can follow along with me. Over the course of the next two missions, you begin pushing into enemy territory under the guise of a nuclear inspection. You get to have a peek at the native cultural architecture of Belka. The castles that their culture are likely so proud of are being converted into heavy barracks for you to total. The people of Belka, or at least the most zealous of them, would probably see this as an insult. This mission goes under the radar without too much to say about it from how humanity is affected, but maybe the point here is that the casualties of war are more than just the people that are condemned, but also what's lost of the past in the flames. There's too many real-world examples to cite between ISIS destroying ancient writings of the Torah and many lost cultural artifacts we can only hope to dig up from World War II bombings, which are only just recently treated with archaeological interest now that the events are approaching 80 years old. The second mission is a variable path one, with the usual differences on a focus between sky, land and mixed targeting, all having different relative difficulties as well. In all three of the Mission 8 scenarios, there's a division between pieces of smaller story. The bombing run is of a commander who's missing in action, likely aware that they're undersupplied for battle. The air-to-ground forces run has a female lieutenant who does everything she can for her soldiers, who view her as a mother, and she can do nothing for them. The dogfighting run has a squadron severely lacking in backup. All of these sub-stories follow a theme that the perfectly honourable soldiers have been undersupplied and abandoned on the battlefront in favour of different tactics. These two missions are to build up a new superweapon. In Mission 7, a flash in the sky. In 8, where the mission objective gets abandoned as the planes you're meant to be clearing a path for get wiped from the map. You're forced with Pixie to escape while a laser from out of the sky attempts to burn you alive by attacking some few miles in front of where you're going to be. The best way to deal with this is to not rush in at full speed, but to carefully fish the laser out and avoid it. Whilst it's not a terribly complex mission ender, the series once again does nothing to steal control from you, but instead it gives you a scenario that enforces an entirely different playstyle. Once again, this is something of a broader statement on video games, but by not creating a QuickTime event or a specific gimmicked game mode that's distinct from the primary gameplay, you're never ripped out of the pilot's seat. It's appropriate for some games to do this, and a variety of game styles or genres within the same game is great for breaking up monotony. There is no single correct way to create a video game after all. But for Ace Combat Zero, and let's say the rest of the numbered series, their intent is clearly one that values an attempt at the player's immersion as the protagonist. The superweapon is named Excalibur. To quote a friendly mercenary, Mission 9 is your chance to take out the King's Sword. There's a set of lock-on jammers between you and Excalibur that can be destroyed, surrounded by protecting optional enemies to build up the boss battle. The problem with trying to take your time to do this mission is that Excalibur's laser is intermittently violating the airspace around you. In this mission, strangely enough, the AI attacks where you are instead of where you're going to be, perhaps balancing out for how the player will sometimes have to make several passes over a single group of targets. Excalibur itself is surrounded by 4 smaller anti-air laser weapons next to 4 power supply buildings. These lasers can fry off 1/10 of your health at a time rather than the whole bar, so whilst dangerous you can risk avoiding them. The entire mission can be done without interacting with anything but Excalibur actually, though it's not recommended. I'd care to see a challenge run like that honestly. It'd be nothing without the anticipation that the radio builds up though. And just like that, Excalibur is felled, with a satisfying crack and tumble like a rusty sword. It almost seems a tad too immediate, The thing's only really introduced last mission and you're already done with it. At this rate, you've already gone through the entire standard array of second trilogy Ace Combat tropes. And you've had just as many set-piece missions and boss fights as perhaps the entirety of Ace Combat 4 in half as many missions. There's a sense that the war really is coming to a close with this, but nothing quite feels right. By taking the sword, it pins Cypher as the king of the sky. In history, there's a minor difference between de facto and de jure rulers, the ones who earn power and the ones who are granted it, which is where the original Arthurian myth comes from. By drawing from this myth, in having Cypher metaphorically draw the sword, he becomes the de facto ruler of the sky, using the symbology of King Arthur's legend without directly taking from it.
Pixie to Crow 3. If you get shot down, crash where I can't see. Roger, leave it to me.
During this mission, a secondary character, PJ, is introduced. His primary character traits are quickly established. He's naive, even headstrong, and his friends rib him about his girlfriend back home. It's shocking he survives the mission with those kinds of character traits, but he's going to stick around for quite some time. His role as far as the themes of the game go are to provide some opposition to Pixie's pessimism. He's a very like him or leave him kind of character, and he opposes the tone of the game quite strongly so far. He even yee-haws in victory. At this point, you unlock the box art plane, the F-15C Eagle, to match Pixie. Pixie's plane can't be changed for him through the game, which is a systematic downgrade from Ace Combat 5, but for the sake of better characterization. Pixie flies his plane. In Japanese samurai mythology, a sword is not simply a sword, but an extension of the self. This is why mech pilots enact body language in mech anime and scream if their mech is being attacked. This is why Samus and Mega Man have their guns as literal arm cannons. The person inside there channels their essence into what they pilot or wear. This has been parodied and deconstructed to death. The default paint job of your F-15C Eagle is an artistic expansion of Pixie's plane's paint job, where only one of his wings are red, both of yours are blue. There's likely nothing here of relevance, but a question I often ask myself is which wing Pixie lost, the painted one or the unpainted one. In relation to that, it seems that Cypher has either lost both of his wings, or he retains both of them. My personal belief is that Cypher has done both at once. Cypher is a flexible moral standpoint of the story, which you create while you fly through the game. If you entertain the idea that Cypher has lost both of his metaphorical wings, and maybe such is true, it might fit in with his namesake. Cypher is another word for zero, so in contrast to solo wing Pixie, there may be something to read into here. Onto the plane purchasing system here, it's a legacy inclusion from Ace Combat 4, with some major differences in presentation, and a per plane kill tally. The planes have their colloquial or officially designated names next to them, such as Eagle or Fishbed or Terminator. Something not done since Ace Combat 3. Ironically, Ace Combat 3 is the latest canonical game in the series, but it's used here to push a kind of nostalgia for a sense of being back in the 90s. The rest of this would be a footnote that I needn't bring up for the sake of time. However, the implication of this system, in this narrative context, is that a mercenary can purchase a fighter jet. Know that fighter jets are commercially available products in this world, marketed towards private citizens and are personalized and customized for the sake of vanity using currency earned in war. This setting is certainly interesting and not played up nearly enough for how cool the idea is, but it implies a lot more horrifying things about the world. A few months' pay can bag you a plane in this world that exceeds the GDP of a small country to produce one of them in our world. Even excusing the throwaway line of Ace Combat 5 about planes being a third cheaper, the issues with the economy are insane. How can several billion-dollar fighter jets be made so cheaply? Then consider the amount of planes you've already downed, likely more planes than have been downed in any real-world war ever. The answer to this puzzle is that these aircraft are in very high demand and they're printed like Pepsi cans for a world inhabited by first-world countries that are almost perpetually at war. High production numbers and the aggressive optimization of a capital-based business breeds low prices. It's almost unthinkable. In our world, a Cold War prevents direct air-to-air combat between the West, Russia and China. But in this world, the liberty to have your own F-15C means they've found a way to throw these things at each other like confetti. Speaking of, the next mission takes place once again at B7R, the Roundtable. Since the inhabitants of Strange Real Earth have such a good working knowledge of King Arthur's legend to crack a joke about it, I feel like there's an obvious question the writers probably were missing here. What kingdom did King Arthur reign over, and where is it on the map? Regardless, I don't know if the mission's placed here as a palate cleanser, but what should happen after a boss fight is some low-effort missions for pacing's sake, where you're pushed into a large-scale hairball immediately. Though the difficulty of the mission's first half is quite subdued, the fighters aren't as aggressive as anywhere else in the game. The alternating A Squadron at the end of this mission are a different story. What they take time to do here is the world build. There's a younger version of a returning character from Ace Combat 5, and you fight alongside the friendly sorcerer and wizard units who take turns chatting over radio. They even seem to know Pixie, calling him by his real name, Larry. It's suspicious how many characters are still being introduced just as the war is being won. It's at about this time that Cypher gains a somewhat peculiar nickname of the Demon Lord of the Roundtable. It's a scary name, and most Western players aren't necessarily going to bat an eye at it, but it's the result of a Japanese pun in the original script which simply got lost in translation. The game's Arthurian themes are no secret. Between Excalibur, the Round Table, and a mission in Glacial, they relate directly to the themes of knighthood and nationalism, and I'll elaborate on that shortly. Cypher's nickname is a reference to the Knights of the Round Table, obviously, or in Japanese, Entaku no Kishi. Kishi would be the word for knight. However, with an extra N at the end, you get the word Kishin, a fierce deity or demon god. The joke here is that Cypher's both valiant and destructive. Perhaps a comparative joke would be to call Cypher a nightmare of the Round Table, if you will. The Japanese pun can be used to describe all three of the player styles that the game encourages. The translation team probably chose to translate it as Demon Lord rather than just with the religious connotations in order to suit this too, whilst entirely losing the joke in the first place. On the subject of unfortunate translation of names, Garm Team itself and the emblem of a dog biting its own chain is likely a poor retransliteration of Garmer, a Norse hellhound, thought of like an analogue to Cerberus. Likely another place the demon name came from as well. It plays into the three ace styles. Is Garmer nothing more than a dog of war? Is it an esteemed role to guard hell? Or is it just a sign of how much of a heartless beast Garmer is? On top of that, Directus was once called Dilectus in Ace Combat 5, and this time both have a valid Latin root, the former meaning to direct and the latter meaning to love. This series doesn't have a lot of luck when it comes to localization, sadly, or maybe it adds more to the mystique of these weird games. You can make use of the squadron system from Ace Combat 5, though that may be a bit of a misnomer now. The D-pad has 6 various commands that you can give to your wingman. By default is cover. Pixie will hold close to your rear and prevent planes chasing you from getting very far. There's attack, which encourages Pixie to break off formation briefly to attack enemies in close proximity. And then there's 3 free commands. For these, Pixie will hang back a little further and sometimes follow chains of enemies to go on a rampage somewhere halfway across the map if the mood takes him. By default, he'll go for anything with a red icon, but you can choose to focus him on sky or ground targets. Finally, you can permit or restrict his usage of whatever special weapon you've asked him to equip. Your orders may not be fully appreciable if the map is a very narrow line of enemies, like in some of the more narratively driven areas. And Pixie has a habit of helping the player out anyway, when you're in trouble. But depending on how loose of a leash you keep on him, he's a bit of a monster, not unlike you. It doesn't necessarily matter to your overall gameplay as far as raw achievement is concerned. If you were alone, you'd probably get along just as fine in most instances. But what's important about this gameplay function is that it fleshes out the role-playing element of the story, whilst affecting how you play the game in general as well. You aren't alone, and Pixie's always there to have your back if you get into a spot of bother, and he loyally follows your commands until he seems to think that you need help. A gameplay purist would argue that having an AI character whose presence is only appreciable narratively is a large waste, and there's a point to that perspective. Pixie's gameplay inclusion is a superficial and random element in this arcade game scoring system, especially when you compare it to Ace Combat 4. This thought, however, ignores what Ace Combat Zero's intention was to be. You might call a few of Zero's gameplay decisions minor subversions of the arcade simulator genre, like the game actively morally judging you for how high your score is, and its effect on the narrative. The intent was clearly not to be a perfect systems-driven video game with an intrinsic gameplay-driven goal. The incorporation of the narrative elements into the gameplay certainly do detract from the gameplay, but in the end it makes for a more emotive and meaningful experience for those who didn't just expect a score attack game. To cap this mission, you've got a difference between 3 more German colours of plane depending on your ace style. The AI works the same other than Mercenary, who get an 8-plane formation instead of a 5-plane one. so there's not much to talk about in terms of gameplay other than it just being hard to be swarmed so strongly. I'd mentioned it earlier, but these fights have attached cutscenes, and only now, halfway in, does the game finally begin to expand on its premise as a war documentary with the alternative interviews. As your enemy fighters so far are the Balkan Air Force, they're typically nationalistic, save for the soldier-style grunt team commander who seems more out to survive. Even among the people Cypher hadn't killed, he's ended careers. There's a menu screen dedicated to notable planes the player has downed through the game, including those in cutscene who appear with profile pictures and a brief synopsis of where and when they came from, and what they went on to do. Whilst the act of killing is confronted through the series, it's never felt so blasé about it. Most of the people you shoot down die. Some of their bodies aren't recovered. Sometimes the crash sites aren't found. Some survive to civilian occupations. Occasionally they escape and flee the law. Occasionally they go on to fight another war. One in particular is MIA, and their spouse reported missing a year later, but a broad number of them are named humans on your kill count. Regardless of how you choose to play the game, there's going to be blood on your hands. One plane from the A squadron you shot down over Directors has an interview with a positive recollection for the player. The people of Directors were cheering to Cypher and Pixie, and the event of you freeing them is celebrated daily as the ringing of the freedom bells. As for Gelb 2, or Rainer Altman, as a less experienced and last surviving member of Gelb, he lives in horror of those memories. He no longer flies the skies, choosing a comfortable life. His takeaway from the experience was the fear that he was going to die as you pursued him, implying he gets flashbacks from those terrifying moments whenever the bells ring again.
To me, they are the sounds of death.
It's the bitter reality of war, true to the taste of the series, whilst also highlighting what necessary evil it is. The inclusion of this man's cutscenes in particular are an excellent focus on this contrast from the experience of an enemy. The souring of the tone here is followed by two of the most morally black missions in the game. There's also an intermission of Pixie relating about your playstyle in Ore, and about how people began to venerate Cypher, and showing Pixie in some way has his own admiration for you as well. Until now, the player has participated in and witnessed several atrocities of war. Friendly soldiers being knowingly sent to their deaths by parachute, just blips on your hood disappearing as they're defenselessly shot in the sky before you can even get to them. Fronts abandoned by enemy higher-ups out of fear, or in a tactical effort to ensnare their enemies into the range of technological miracle weapons. You're part of an invasion of foreign land guised as a nuclear inspection, and depending on your playstyle, you've been obliterating civilian housing simply for more pay. I might risk saying, but there may not be a single mission so far where there wasn't a war crime of some kind. In the previous mission, PJ claims he's fighting for peace in order to end the war. These are wars more or less fought on their air dominance. Pixie's response is poignant. Can you stop bloodshed with more bloodshed? I suppose if you take that thought to an extreme, there won't be anybody else left to kill. So perhaps so. On the approach to your mission, the city's already in flames. It's a major fuel reserve and refinery for Belka, and a civilian town. The Allied bombing is completely indiscriminate of that. Over the radio, there's not just enemies reacting to the situation. There are factory workers still operating, killed live on comms. As this escalates, the fire starts increasing out of control. Not because of the bombing alone, though. As if there wasn't enough things going against the regular people of this town, the Balkan army has ordered a salted earth retreat in response to the Scorched Earth approach. That is, to enact friendly military arson during a bombing raid. In the previous cutscenes, the narrator mentioned that multiple cities in South Balka were surrendering, as the Balkan government's operations began drastically favouring the northern birthplace of their nation. In an attempt to destroy anything the Allies can use after they claim the town, the collateral damage includes the town and its inhabitants. Perhaps it's viewed as acceptable because the people aren't seen as true Balkans. There's visible explosions that are occurring on the surface as the town becomes uninhabitable. The Balkans are even struggling to deal with their own wounded soldiers in their haste, never mind civilians, which are completely ignored. Something's got to be said here about the creative use of the static lighting model they use for the planes. The luminance is coming from under you, emphasizing the flames of the city. There's no real technological advancement in the method that they do it since Ace Combat 4 or 5, it's just a different utility that's used to great effect. The mission is also capped off with a fight featuring a new addition since Ace Combat 5, functional stealth fighters. The game takes it easy on you the first time though, as they're only a bunch of F-35s. They're visible on radar until within combat range, when they only fade into radar view as they're in front of your plane. It's in this scenario that Pixie can truly prove his worth by covering you thoroughly. All through the game, he's got to be one of the most effective partner AIs you'll have the pleasure of working with outside of some scripted events. The normal people of this town have been fucked over from both sides. Perhaps it says something that not even Pixie can stomach it. But how do you feel as a player? Do you even know what you're fighting for anymore? It's no lie that this game is inspired by the events of World War II. All sides saw towns burned down by indiscriminate bombing. In the UK it was the Blitz, in Japan it was firebombing, and worse, the most relevant, the German government saw fit to continue war until Berlin was nothing but rubble, calling any German that didn't fight traitors. The reason for these parallels, and the calling on King Arthur's legend, is to solicit a theme of nationalism. Of World War II, the only sustaining lesson learned from Germany and Japan's descent was that an excess of nationalism can drive countries to their own certain doom. It's often ignored how nationalism was used to rally the troops against the Nazis too. The Balkan War starts with an invasion not unlike that of Germany to Poland, but this time with more reasonable motives. Ossia for decades has been on less than friendly terms to Belka, and arguably caused Belka's financial crisis to begin with through betrayals in joint economic projects. This conspiracy theory is supported by many of the seceding territories from Belka joining Ossia. Any country would be afraid of that kind of pressure. Any people would be afraid of that. The primary theme of this game is about nationalism and its alternatives. Clearly the nationalist zeal of the Balkan Air Force, the false faith troops have in their commanders, the idea of having a country behind you empowers you, or that your country is inherently superior to the point of making all other countries irrelevant. These aren't functional ideas. In a vacuum at least. You can still embrace these ideas in the game by acting as a knight, one who fights for the country of Ustio despite their war crimes, with a sense of seemingly undeserved honor. On the other hand, acting as a soldier, one who survives and acts under amoral individualism, lacks meaning. These characters in interview have no ultimate goal, and they never end up achieving anything. One such character only finds meaning when they seek revenge against Cypher for shooting them down, which is probably a positive influence. The one that needs more explaining may be Mercenary. Mercenaries in the West have an image of being guns for hire, but in Japan they're more like stateless armies. They get a bad rap for resembling bandits in their lack of care for things like honor or war etiquette. It fits with how the game interprets your actions of chasing after high-value targets. Summarized, being a mercenary means being stateless in a world of states for this game. None of the sides in this game get off easily. Each is treated negatively by the game world and the events, and in interview, each professor of their philosophy treats other philosophies negatively, whilst being taken down a peg themselves by said philosophies. There's quite a huge downside to each, and there is no right answer presented. In the larger contrast to nationalism, outside of the player's control over their own actions, there's Ossia itself, a hyper-federation, one that might even represent globalism in the larger canon of Strange Reel. Like the United States, it's a collection of states forming a larger state. That is another alternative to nationalism, allowing the culture and independence of your nation to be devoured by a larger entity for some sense of security. There is no state within Ossia that is ever named. It's as if they lose their identity when being subsumed. The depiction here is that a federation is effectively a bureaucracy that turns any country that joins it into a vassal. The through line between all of these examples is that they are grounded within a world wherein states and countries exist, even if it's simply for show. All of the playstyles still require a war to fight for them to exist. They still require a world with borders to allow for the collision of countries. What alternative is there to that? Mission 12, Stage of the Apocalypse. The operation is to travel to a meeting point. Whilst Crow Team is still picking on PJ again, Pixie lags behind. Some dead air is used at the start of the mission to generate that too quiet discomfort before the mission is updated. Balkan bombers are oncoming, the target unknown, carrying nuclear warheads. Pixie's right response to this is that if they just blew everything up, perhaps there'd be no war. He's expressing a lot of dissatisfaction with his place in the war, justifiably, but his attitude at this point starts to seem unhealthy. To be fair, what are you even fighting for at this point? There's no side in the entire war that seems reasonable. There's an entire convoy of Balkan military performing one last-ditch nuclear attack. Of course they're unreasonable. It's worthy of note for Belka though that there are some enemy fighters ignoring you, and they're trying to intercept the nuclear bombers themselves. We've reached a point so low that the only thing that might possibly redeem the Balkan people is infighting. Like you needed some more reason to doubt your own role in this war, those interceptors are presented as optional yellow targets for extra points. The bombers have fully rotational turrets to attack back, and they do take chunks out of your health, so the mission can be quite difficult if you're going in for slow, close approaches, especially with the aggressive enemy buzzards flocking around you. The internal conflict from the military is apparent just in the interactions between the enemy interceptors and the enemy bombers. An argument over who the true Balkans are, the ones carrying the nukes or the ones saying to turn back. The combat, number of planes, and confusion between the surprise mission event and the Balkans attacking each other. It leaves the whole thing feeling rather hectic right up until all the enemy bombers on radar are gone. Your comrades give some brief chant of victory, but there's no mission success jingle just yet. When vision returns, the lighting has certainly changed, though nothing seems too out of the ordinary for around 5 seconds. The game actually dips the frame rate for those 5 seconds artistically to exacerbate the motion on screen once the shockwave reaches you. At this point, the radar on your HUD and radio begin exhibiting electromagnetic interference. If you look for it, there's a bright spot in the sky where the fireball is rising up. It makes sense in retrospect. Of course there wouldn't just be one convoy you were lucky enough to intercept. This is a nuclear blast from the perspective of a cockpit, given the respect of around 30 seconds without any radio or background music. All other planes you haven't downed so far have become optional yellow targets, and you can only assume you appear similarly to them. Pausing the game will reveal that the current objective is survive. A major pacing reason why Excalibur was so quickly introduced and forgotten is to give breathing room to a very serious depiction of nuclear weapons. A real-world superweapon which likely needs no introduction. Pixie has another chat with Wizard 1, previously an ally, now showing up on radar as a red target and skirting around the outside of the playfield. The previous conversation in Mission 10 alluded to discussions beforehand that they should get out of their dead-end jobs, but Pixie seemed to imply that he had plans other than whatever Wizard 1 was suggesting. They both clearly have a history. This time, Pixie, or Larry, has a back and forth where they joke that it's like a birthday. He tells the player that he's found a reason to fight, and then he opens fire on you. With a failing electronic system, you're forced to avoid Pixie's fire whilst taking out a small collection of enemies. Though you've taken out all that you could have, the Balkans had sent several more nuclear convoys along the borders of North Balka. 7 were successful. The missions were not to attack the enemy, but to make the mountain region surrounding North Balka uninhabitable and unstable to mount an attack past. The Balkans nuked their own country 7 times across the Waldreich Mountains, killing an estimated 12,000 of their own civilians. I don't know if there's many other games or writers that could effectively write up to a war crime this absolutely absurd. Within the romanticized fiction of Ace Combat, this fits in perfectly as a mirror to real-world events, where exceeding nationalism destroyed the very nation it believed in so pridefully. There's no need to say that the entire setup of this story is ridiculous. It was mentioned as part of the lore, and the writer of this game may well have been backed into a corner in order to accommodate a war where 7 nukes fell in one area. But the lead up to the event doesn't try to hide the absurd claim, but backs it up by escalating the forms of war crime from bombing civilians to bombing your own civilians and everything in between. True to the series, there's an overly earnest sensibility within it. The narrator poses the question, what did Cypher think of all this? A question directed at the player. The events of these 2 missions will tend to force the player to review their own role-played actions through the game. Can you still fight for your nation when this is what it brought Belka? Or will it encourage you to think that Ustio is worth fighting for as a lesser evil? Can you still indiscriminately destroy all targets when civilian casualty rates and innocent deaths are taken this seriously? Can you still accept just getting by on survival? Fence-sitting whilst atrocities happen around you? I wouldn't be surprised if most players change their target A style entirely from here, and it's a good opportunity to. Their choices from here may well still be canonized within the interviews. Ace Combat as a series is incredibly romantic, in an artistic sense. It sews myth, legend, and religion into its narrative to appeal to them, and give some backing to its extremely dramatic and sincere writing. In a way, these games are comparative to modern myth, complete with tragedy, betrayal, and melodrama. The natural struggle of writing something with the power of mythology in a medium that has player interaction as its delivery vehicle is an incredibly hard balance to maintain. And that expert touch is what it takes to make such an objective and undisputed victory feel like a sin.
This is where we go our separate ways.